August 1950. A torrential storm is pounding the earth. But the thunder isn't coming from the sky. It's coming from an unstoppable wave of Soviet-made tanks crushing everything in their path. For 2 months, they haven't lost a single battle. In just 6 weeks, an entire nation has been erased from the map. The army is broken. The government is fleeing. Panic is everywhere. All that is left of South Korea is this: a tiny box of land, 140 miles wide, with the ocean at their backs. There is nowhere left to run. There are no more reinforcements. The order is simple: stand or die. To understand how the world came this close to total disaster, we have to rewind just 8 weeks to June 25, 1950. When the North Korean army crossed the border, it wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. They moved like a well-oiled machine, spearheaded by hundreds of Soviet T-34 tanks, monsters of steel that the South Korean weapons simply bounced off of. The defenders were outgunned, outnumbered, and completely unprepared. Even when American forces rushed in to help, they were swept aside. They tried to hold the line at Osan. They tried at Dagin, but every time they were encircled and crushed. It was humiliation after humiliation. For weeks, the only strategy was run. Now, the retreat has ended. The shattered remains of the United Nations forces have been pushed into a rectangular box in the southeast corner of the peninsula. To their west is the Nekdong River, a natural moat they hope will slow the enemy down. To their east and south is the ocean. Inside this perimeter, supplies are piling up, and fresh troops are arriving at the port of Busan every day. But the enemy knows this too. The North Korean commanders know that if they don't break this line now, they lose the war, and so they are throwing everything they have at the river. General Walton Walker, the man in charge of the defense, knows the truth. There is no evacuation plan. There are no boats coming to save them, like at Dunkirk. If the line breaks, the war is over. They have to buy time for a miracle. But time is the one thing they do not have. It was called the meat grinder, and for good reason. The entire defense of the Pusan Perimeter relied on a single, desperate strategy: mobile warfare. The perimeter was too long, and the defenders were too few. If the Americans and South Koreans spread out evenly along the line, the North Korean army would just punch through the weakest spot and pour into the rear. So General Walker had to gamble. He kept his forces thin along the river, barely enough to watch the water, and held a reserve force back in the Santara Fire Brigade. When the enemy attacked, they had to rush to the crisis point, fight a brutal battle to plug the hole, and then immediately turn around and rush to the next emergency. It was a deadly game of whack-a-mole, played with artillery and blood. The first major test came at the Nekdong Bulge. In the dead of night, thousands of North Korean soldiers stripped down to their underwear, carrying their weapons and uniforms on rafts, and silently waded across the river. By morning, they had seized the high ground. The fighting that followed was some of the most vicious of the 20th century. It wasn't just a gunfight. It was hand-to-hand combat on steep, muddy hillsides in the scorching August heat. Soldiers fought until they ran out of ammunition, then they fought with bayonets, and finally with rocks and fists. But the biggest nightmare was still the tanks. The T-34s seemed invincible. American bazooka rounds were bouncing off their front armor like pebbles, but the defenders were learning. They realized the tanks were blind in the treacherous terrain. Brave hunter-killer teams began sneaking up close, dangerously close, to hit the tanks from the side or rear, or to jam explosives into their tracks. Day after day, the North Koreans hammered the line. They broke through at Daegu. They broke through at Busan. At one point, they were within mortar range of the chaotic airfield at Busan itself. The perimeter was shrinking. The hospitals were overflowing. The stench of death hung over the valleys. But every time the line bent, the fire brigade arrived just in time to push the enemy back. They were bending, but they were not breaking. Yet exhaustion was setting in. Men were falling asleep in their foxholes while firing their weapons. They knew they couldn't keep this up forever. They needed a game changer. They needed a miracle. And little did they know, hundreds of miles away, a plan was being formed that would change the course of history. While the soldiers in the mud were fighting for every inch of the perimeter. General Douglas MacArthur was looking at a map hundreds of miles away. He didn't just want to save the army. He wanted to destroy the enemy completely. He came up with a plan so dangerous that almost every other general told him it was suicide. His idea was a massive amphibious landing, not at Busan to reinforce the line, but at Inchon City, way up the coast, right near Seoul. It was the absolute worst place to land a ship. The tides were monstrous, rising and falling 30 feet, and the harbour was guarded by massive seawalls. If the timing was off by even a few hours, the ships would be stranded in the mud, sitting ducks for enemy artillery. But MacArthur bet everything on one simple fact: the North Koreans would never expect it. On September 15th, the gamble paid off. Thousands of U.S. Marines stormed the sea walls at Inchon, hundreds of miles behind the enemy lines. It was a complete surprise. Within days, they had recaptured Seoul and severed the main supply line for the entire North Korean army. Suddenly, the besiegers became the besieged. The North Korean forces attacking Busan were cut off from their food, their ammunition, and their command. Panic spread through their ranks like wildfire. This was the moment General Walker had been waiting for. The anvil at Busan finally struck back. The exhausted defenders roared out of the perimeter, launching a massive counterattack against a crumbling enemy. Caught between the hammer dropping from Inchon and the anvil pushing from Busan, the North Korean army didn't just retreat, it disintegrated. In a matter of days, the red map turned blue again. The soldiers who had been told to stand or die were now chasing the enemy all the way back to the border. The line had held, the gamble had worked. The breakout was complete. If you walk through the streets of Busan today, you will see a glittering high-tech metropolis. It is one of the busiest ports in the world, filled with skyscrapers, neon lights, and the hustle of a modern superpower. It is hard to imagine that 70 years ago, this same ground was nothing but mud, refugees, and desperate soldiers praying for one more day of life. The Pusan Perimeter was more than just a battle. It was the difference between existence and extinction. If that thin line had broken, if those exhausted men had taken one step back, South Korea as we know it would simply not exist. There would be no Samson, no global culture, no democracy in the South. The entire peninsula would have been swallowed whole. In a quiet corner of the city lies the United Nations Memorial Cemetery. It is the final resting place for thousands of soldiers from all over the world. Americans, British, Turkish, and many others who came to a country they didn't know to defend a people they had never met. They were given an impossible order: stand or die. They chose to stand, and because they did, a nation survived.